This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason, and this episode 847 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. I went into last week's Sleeper Show with this feeling that it was going to be a rough week, and it ended up being kind of a rough week. Derek Carr and Kenny Pickett got hurt, so they weren't good plays. Jeff Wilson didn't get that much run as a game script play, and all of the tight end streamers were pretty bad. And then with the deeper plays, Jalen Guyton, Justin Watson, the Saints wide receivers, they weren't worth it. The best call of the week, though, definitely Jake Browning. He was the QB4, he scored almost 27 fantasy points. Jonathan Mingo wasn't bad, and Curtis Samuel hit double-digit PPR points. I also called out Ezekiel Elliott, but I didn't anticipate a Ramondre Stevenson injury. So the result was a win, but it happened because of an injury. I don't really want to take that W. Like I said, though, last week I even mentioned that it was a tough week, and that ended up being the case. I'm ready to bounce back here in week 14. Now, as usual, we'll kick things off this week by looking at players rostered in 10 to 50% of Yahoo leagues who you could consider starting. And we'll look at quarterback and start with Gardner Minshew. Minshew's probably the safest quarterback streamer this week. He gets Cincinnati, and the Bengals are a top 10 matchup for quarterbacks by adjusted points allowed. The Bengals have faced some really good quarterbacks of late, but they've also allowed a top 10 performance in each of their last 4. And 3 of those quarterbacks were top 5. So Minshew's okay. I do think that Josh Dobbs still has more upside than Minshew, though, assuming he starts. Dobbs will have a short leash after his performance last time that we saw in Minnesota, but he's proven to have a good ceiling on a week-to-week basis in fantasy. Prior to that performance, he had ranked 13th, 8th, 4th, 3rd, and 13th in weekly scoring. That's because he was averaging 40 rushing yards per game during that stretch. He now gets Justin Jefferson back, and the Vikings get the Raiders. Vegas has actually been an okay team this year against quarterbacks by adjusted points allowed. They rank as the 21st most advantageous matchup. I'm not overly concerned about that, though. It's not like they're facing the Jets. Dobbs has the most upside of any quarterback streamer this week. And then you could look at Jake Browning, too. His matchup this week against the Colts, it isn't as good as the one that he had last week against the Jags, but it's still not bad. Indy's the 11th best matchup for quarterbacks by adjusted fantasy points allowed. Browning's also shown off a little bit of rushing upside since taking over for Joe Burrow. He's been giving fantasy managers a couple points per game with his legs. The weapons are there, the environment's not bad. He could give you another serviceable performance. Now, moving on to running backs, I want to go back to Roschon Johnson. I feel like people forget the fact that the last time we saw Chicago, Roschon Johnson played 74% of the Bears' offensive snaps. And it was a pretty neutral to positive game script. Now, D'Onta Foreman wasn't healthy for that game. You'll want to keep an eye on Foreman's practice reports. With that being said, if the Bears hit a negative game script against Detroit this week, I'd anticipate Johnson being on the field. According to FantasyLife.com's utilization report, Roschon has played 100% of the team's 2-minute snaps in 3 of their last 4 games. Johnson's a pretty strong play if Foreman's out. If Foreman's in, he's more of a cross-your-fingers option in PPR formats. Now, I know that Derrick Henry isn't in concussion protocol, but I do think that Tyjae Spears is still kind of interesting this week. The Titans are huge underdogs against Miami this week, and Spears has a 90% 2-minute offense snap rate this season, according to Fantasy Life. When Tennessee's trailing, he's the back who's on the field. He's seen at least an 11% target share in each of his last 6 games, too. Now, Miami doesn't typically funnel targets to opposing running backs, but Spears could get a higher than normal snap count this week. That makes him flex-worthy in some leagues. I don't mind Ty Chandler this week either. He's seen at least a 31% snap share in each of his last 3, coinciding with Cam Akers' season-ending injury, and he scored double-digit PPR points in 2 of those 3 games. Alexander Mattison, he's the 1A in that offense. But against a Vegas defense that ranks as the 7th best matchup for running backs by adjusted points allowed, both of these Vikings running backs have a chance to come through with decent days. Now, at wide receiver, at the time of this recording, Elijah Moore is still rostered in fewer than 50% of Yahoo leagues, and I like him this week. Moore saw his highest air yard share and average depth of target with Joe Flacco in Week 13. The Browns finally used Elijah Moore the way he should probably be used. He led the entire NFL in air yards. With Amari Cooper dealing with a concussion, there's a real chance Elijah Moore is Cleveland's wide receiver 1 this week. And they get a Jags team that ranks as the 7th best matchup for wide receivers in adjusted points allowed. Now, aside from Moore, I don't love the other 2 wide receivers that I'm about to call out in this tier. They're pretty in line with some of the deeper plays at wide receiver that I'm going to get to in a second. But Khalil Shakir is back after a bye in Week 13. And in a game against Kansas City, I don't totally mind him. That contest has a healthy 47.5 point over-under according to FanDuel Sportsbook. And the Chiefs rank 8th this season in slot target share allowed. Shakir has run 77% of his routes from that area of the field. Now, Shakir's seen a boost without Dawson Knox in that lineup. Keep an eye on reports, but I couldn't find anything on Dawson Knox's potential return. But in this matchup, and with over 11 PPR points per game over his last 5, Shakir's definitely in play. And then there's one other slot matchup that I want to talk about. The Steelers have been horrible against slot wideouts forever, and this year's no different. On the season, Pittsburgh is allowing by far, the highest yards per route run to slot players. They get New England this week, and the Patriots could be without Demario Douglas. Douglas has played about 2/3 of his snaps from the slot this season. If he's out, we're going to see a lot of different wide receivers get some looks. And it's a really dumb game environment. I get it. The Patriots have a team total of like 12 points. But with that being said, one player who might benefit from all of this is one who's got a revenge game. Juju Smith-Schuster. He hasn't been productive at all over his last 3 games, but he did see a 97% route participation last week without Douglas. It's a desperation move, but the matchup's there. At tight end this week, I'm surprised that Isaiah Likely is still rostered in fewer than 50% of leagues. Since Mark Andrews' injury, Likely has run a route on about 83% of Baltimore's dropbacks. That's a really, really strong number at tight end. The last time that we saw him, he had a 20% target share. And this week, Baltimore gets a Rams team that's allowed the 3rd most adjusted points to tight ends. According to my rankings this week, Likely is a tight end 1. I also really like Cade Otton. He's not always getting you production, but we know that he's going to be running routes. He's got the 2nd best route participation this season at tight end across the entire league. Now, he didn't see a single target last week against Carolina, but the Panthers have actually been pretty good against tight ends this year. Atlanta has not been good against tight ends. The Falcons are the 5th best matchup according to adjusted points allowed, and they rank 1st in adjusted target share allowed to tight ends. So I love Otton this week as a streamer. And then the last thing I want to throw out there is that if Dalton Schultz misses this week against the Jets, don't forget about Brevin Jordan. Jordan ran around on 67% of CJ Stroud's dropbacks last week, and he saw a 15% target share. Because of the Jets secondary, they often funnel targets to tight ends. They rank 3rd in adjusted target share allowed to the position. That's led them to being the 7th most advantageous matchup. So keep an eye on that situation. Now, the next tier consists of players rostered in fewer than 10% of leagues, so say it with me, we're digging deeper. Joe Flacco's the quarterback streamer from this group. He looked competent this past week and was confident throwing the ball down the field, and that could come in handy against Jacksonville. The Jags are not only a top 5 matchup for quarterbacks by adjusted points allowed, but they're 10th in air yards allowed. And they're also 10th in completion rate allowed on 15+ air yard throws. So Flacco makes plenty of sense as a streamer. Now at running back, I'm going to throw DJ Dallas's name out there like I did in the 15 transactions episode. Because Zach Charbonnet and Kenneth Walker are both banged up. If one of those 2 players goes, I would not play Dallas. But if both are out, then Dallas would be a volume-based RB3 this week. It's not a great matchup, but the volume could be there. Chase Brown's another one to consider in this tier. He's obviously going to play the RB2 role behind Joe Mixon. But the Colts are a top 5 matchup for running backs by adjusted points allowed, and Brown is coming off a game where he saw a season-high 32% running back rush share. He ran the ball 9 times this past week for 61 yards. He's definitely a deep option, but some of you could be desperate this week. Now moving on to wide receiver, there are actually some okay options this week in this tier. Let's start with the combination of Robert Woods and John Mechie. Without Tank Dell, Noah Brown is probably going to play a little bit more on the perimeter than he typically does. And then Nico Collins is obviously going to be on the outside too. Brown ended up playing out wide on over 65% of his routes this past week. The slot will likely be occupied by a combination of Robert Woods and John Mechie. And for the record, I'm generalizing when I talk about wide receiver alignment. Teams rotate their wide receivers all the time. Like Nico Collins will probably see some slot snaps. This is just a probability thing. But the slot matchup is interesting this week for Mechie and Woods, and even Noah Brown because he'll be thrown in there at times this week too. The Jets are amazing against wide receivers, but they've allowed the third highest target share to the slot this year. With the Texans still projected to score some points, their implied team total is middle of the road this week, those guys could benefit. Now, speaking of slot matchups, with Christian Kirk out, we might see Parker Washington handle the slot for Jacksonville. In fact, we should expect that to happen. He ran the third most routes at wide receiver for the Jags in Week 13, and 81% of those routes came from the slot. He was a slot player in college, too. My prospect model actually didn't mind Parker Washington. He had a high draft capital delta, which means the model liked him a lot more than where he was actually drafted. It's just that he fell to a spot in Jacksonville where he would be buried on the depth chart. Now he has some opportunity, and while Cleveland's a tough matchup on paper, the Browns do rank first in target share allowed to the slot this year. He's not a locked-in, obvious play, but he does work in deeper formats. Now, at the time of this recording, I'm not entirely sure what's going on with Christian Watson. Is he hurt? Is he not hurt? How long is he going to be out? I have no idea. But if he is out, like I talked about in the 15 transactions episode, don't sleep on Dontavian Wicks. He saw a significant jump in route participation earlier this season without Christian Watson, and he's led the Packers in yards per route run this year. So keep an eye on that situation. And then the last wideout in this tier, Alec Pierce. The Colts have used him a little bit more over his last two games. His route participation has always been there. He's gotten a ton of cardio this year. But he's seen target shares of 15% in each of his last two games. And last week, he scored 19 PPR points. Now Pierce will get Cincinnati. It's a team allowing the 13th most adjusted points to wide receivers. Pierce is also a down-the-field threat, and the Bengals are allowing the highest average depth of target in the league. He's a volatile player for sure, but the matchup's there. Now, looking at defensive streamers this week, Houston's now rostered in a lot of leagues, but like I said in the 15 transactions episode, they're an obvious play against the Jets. There's also Green Bay against the Giants. During the Giants' last 4 games, which is where Tommy DeVito has thrown it 20-plus times in each game, they've allowed 8, 5, 9, and 6 sacks. So Green Bay should be good. And then lastly, Minnesota does make some sense against Las Vegas this week. The Raiders are a top 10 matchup for defenses and adjusted fantasy points allowed. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. As a reminder, there's no mailbag episode or Late Round Perspectives episode this week. So this is the last show of the week. So good luck this weekend. I'll talk to you on Tuesday with the 15 transactions episode. Have a great weekend.